Welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. Today we're going to tackle something pretty big. President Trump's surprise announcement of 25% tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico. And get this, they're supposed to go into effect tomorrow.
Wow.
I know, right? It's a pretty crazy situation.
Yeah.
We've got a whole bunch of sources here, news articles, economic analyses, all that stuff. And our mission is to really try to figure out, what prompted this seemingly sudden decision, and then we'll kind of look at what this whole tariff thing could mean for everyone involved. Because, when the U.S. makes a move like this, the whole world kind of sits up and takes notice.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a pretty big deal.
So before we dive into the impact and all that, let's quickly set the stage. So back in February, Trump set an initial deadline for these tariffs.
Right.
Then came extensions and just a whole lot of mixed messaging coming from the administration. I mean, Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, he suggested things were fluid, but then Trump countered with this no wiggle room stance. It's just been a whirlwind.
It certainly has. And it's interesting, how those shifting deadlines in these pronouncements, they can be used strategically in negotiations. It creates this element of surprise, and it could really shift the power dynamics. Having to constantly adjust to these changes really puts the other parties at a disadvantage.
So given that, do you think that February 1st deadline was ever a real possibility, or was it just a tactic from the get-go?
That's a great question. And it's hard to say for sure, but it's definitely a possibility. And, we have to remember, Trump has stated his reasons for these tariffs are to punish Canada and Mexico for fentanyl trafficking and illegal immigration into the U.S.
Right. He's been very vocal about that. But imposing tariffs seems like kind of an unusual way to address those issues.
Exactly.
Yeah.
While those are certainly serious concerns, using tariffs as a direct response is a bit like trying to fix a leaky faucet with a hammer. You might stop the leak, but you're probably going to cause more damage in the process. The fentanyl crisis and immigration are incredibly complex issues, with deep roots. So a simple tariff might not be the most effective or even appropriate solution.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. So then what about the potential economic fallout? I mean, we're already hearing about possible price increases for consumers here in the U.S., and then not to mention the possibility of retaliatory tariffs from Canada and Mexico.
Absolutely, and it's crucial to understand just how interconnected the North American economies really are. These tariffs could create a ripple effect.
Wow.
Impacting specific industries like the auto industry, disrupting supply chains and ultimately costing jobs on all sides of the border.
Right.
In fact, consumer confidence actually dipped in February as people started, worrying about the looming tariffs and the potential for higher prices. So the economic anxiety is definitely real.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of anxiety, there's another development that kind of adds a whole other layer to this situation. On the same day as the tariff announcement, we heard about Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing company, TSMC, pledging a massive $100 billion investment in U.S. semiconductor plants.
It does seem like an interesting juxtaposition, doesn't it? You have this seemingly protectionist move with the tariffs, but then you're also, actively encouraging foreign investment.
So how do those two seemingly contradictory actions fit together?
Well, it could be part of a broader carrot and stick approach to trade policy.
Okay.
The stick being the threat of tariffs and the carrot being incentives like the CHIPS Act grant, which encourages companies to invest in U.S. manufacturing.
Right.
In fact, Commerce Secretary Letnick asserted that the threat of tariffs on semiconductors was actually a factor in TSMC's decision to increase their investment.
So maybe there's a method to the madness after all.
Yeah, maybe so. It's certainly a complex situation with a lot of moving parts. But focusing on the TSMC investment for a moment, I mean, $100 billion pledge is, it's massive.
Yeah.
Even for a company like TSMC, it makes you wonder what kind of impact this is going to have on the U.S. semiconductor industry.
It does seem like a potential game changer, especially considering, that the U.S. has been trying to regain its dominance in semiconductor manufacturing for years.
Exactly. And it's not just about the money.
Right.
It's about bringing high-tech jobs back to the U.S., boosting innovation, strengthening our supply chain security.
So it sounds like the TSMC investment could be a significant piece of a much larger strategy.
Yeah.
One that goes beyond just these tariffs on Canada and Mexico.
It does appear that way. It seems like the goal might be to kind of reshape the global landscape of technology and manufacturing with the U.S. in a more, dominant position.
That makes sense. But going back to those tariffs, what happens next? I mean, do Canada and Mexico just accept them, or do they push back?
Well, both countries have already stated that they plan to retaliate with tariffs of their own targeting U.S. goods.
Oh, wow.
So we could be on the brink of a trade war that could really hurt everyone involved.
And nobody wants to see that happen, especially with our closest neighbors.
Right.
So is it possible that these tariffs are really just a negotiating tactic, a way to bring Canada and Mexico to the table and force them to make concessions?
It's certainly possible. President Trump has a history of using tariffs as leverage in trade negotiations. And he's shown that he's willing to follow through on his threats.
But on the other hand, there's a lot of pressure from U.S. businesses and lawmakers who are worried about the potential economic fallout of a trade war.
That's right. So it's a delicate balancing act. He needs to weigh the potential benefits of a tough stance against the very real risk of serious economic consequences.
It feels like this high-stakes game of chicken where nobody wants to blink first.
Yeah.
But let's step back for a moment and look at this from a different angle. What do these tariffs and this potential trade war mean for everyday people in the U.S., Canada, and Mexico?
That's a crucial question because at the end of the day, these decisions made by governments have real-world consequences for families and communities. Tariffs can lead to higher prices for consumers, job losses in affected industries, and an overall sense of economic uncertainty.
It's easy to get caught up in the political maneuvering and all the economic jargon, but we can't lose sight of the human impact.
I agree, and that's why it's so important to have these conversations.
Yeah.
We need to talk about the potential consequences of these policies, both good and bad. We need to think about the long-term impacts on everyone involved, not just the short-term gains for a select few.
So where does all of this leave us? We've got tariffs going into effect, trade tensions escalating, and a massive investment in U.S. manufacturing all happening at the same time. It's a lot to unpack.
It is, and it really underscores how complex and interconnected the global economy is. These things are constantly evolving. We have to stay informed, think critically, and be ready to adapt.
And that's what we aim to do here on The Deep Dive. We want to equip you with the knowledge and understanding you need to navigate these complicated issues.
Exactly, because once you understand the why behind these decisions, you're in a much better position to find solutions that work for everyone.
Now, before we wrap things up, I want to leave you with something to think about. If tariffs are a tool that can be used to encourage companies to move their manufacturing operations to the U.S., is that inherently a good thing? What about the potential disruptions to other countries' economies and the livelihoods of their workers?
That's a really important question, and it's a complex one without any easy answers. It's a conversation that we need to be having.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive today. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, it really makes you think about the bigger picture, doesn't it? It's not always as simple as it seems on the surface.
It rarely is, but I think that's one of the most valuable things about, really examining these issues in depth.
Yeah.
It helps us move beyond those initial gut reactions and start to understand the nuances and the complexities at play.
Right. And that's what we've tried to do today with this deep dive into President Trump's tariff announcement. We started by mapping out the timeline, looking at those shifting deadlines and the element of surprise that introduced.
And we talked about Trump's stated reasons for the tariffs, fentanyl trafficking and illegal immigration and how those are serious issues. But whether tariffs are the most effective way to address them is certainly debatable.
For sure. And we also kind of delved into the potential economic repercussions, particularly considering how closely the economies of the U.S., Canada, and Mexico are intertwined.
Right.
And of course, we can't forget about the looming threat of retaliatory tariffs and a potential trade war.
Right. And then there's the wild card of the TSMC investment.
Yeah.
A $100 billion commitment to U.S. semiconductor manufacturing that could signal a broader strategy at play, one that goes beyond just these immediate trade disputes.
It really feels like we're at a crossroads, this whole situation, with the tariffs has the potential to reshape the landscape of North American trade and maybe even global trade in some pretty significant ways.
It certainly does. And as we move forward, I think it's crucial that we keep asking those tough questions.
Yeah.
What are the long-term goals?
Okay.
What are the potential unintended consequences? And how can we find solutions that benefit everyone, not just a select few?
Because ultimately, it's about more than just economic indicators and political maneuvering.
Right.
It's about people's lives, their livelihoods, and the kind of world we want to live in.
Well said.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.